It looks like some folks are still trickling in, so we'll give it just a couple of minutes. Yeah, I think we're going to get started, folks. Welcome to the monthly directors call, and I'm going to turn it over to Dina here shortly. But hope everybody is in the post-holiday catch-up mode, or at least surviving with a snorkel. And it is a busy time of year, and the legislature is in session, and everybody's got close eyes on what's happening there. But we wanted to take a few minutes today and talk about ESY and some of the issues around ESY. And so with that, I'm going to just quickly turn it over to Dina. Thank you, Dina.
Yeah. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us and with Jose Martin. Jose has been helping the department since 2007. I was looking back at some things, and we're very blessed to have him. And I'm not going to take a lot of time to go through that. I know many of you know Jose, and Jose, I'll let you go ahead and take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jose Martin. I'm a special ed attorney out of Texas. This is all I've done from day one as an attorney is really work with school districts and special ed, Section 504 ADA. Today, we're going to discuss ESY services. And look, part of the materials I may go quickly through to leave you an opportunity to read them on your own because I do want to leave time at the end at least 10 to 15 minutes for your questions, which I'm most interested in. And in talking about extended year services, the way that I kind of structured the materials is I started with the federal regulation, which is very basic. The regulation simply says, look, schools have to provide extended school year services if they determine that it's necessary for the child to receive overall an appropriate education. And then there's some baseline limitations. They do tell you, you can't limit ESY to kids with specific disabilities categorically. And you can't unilaterally or categorically just decide where we're just going to provide this type of service and not this, or decide we're only going to provide a certain amount of services, or we're only going to provide ESY for X amount of days, for example, during the summer. It's got to be an individualized determination for every student. These are the baseline fundamentals of the federal rules. I was asked to see if the department's guidance is really something that needs to be adjusted based on the new FAPE standard. Well, the modern FAPE standard of the Supreme Court's decision in Andrew. And I don't think so because Andrew really just kind of gave us different words for the same idea that the Supreme Court had in 1982. In 1982, an appropriate education under IDA was one that provided the child educational benefit. We always understood that to mean meaningful educational benefit, not merely trivial. And the Andrew Court basically said an appropriate education is one where you design an IEP in a way that it's going to provide the child appropriate progress in light of their circumstances. So I think the standard for ESY is you need to provide ESY if it's needed for the child to maintain their appropriate progress. And if because otherwise, if you don't provide ESY, then that progress will be lost. That's the entire idea of ESY under IDEA. And your rules, which I cite here, really just restate the substance and the language of the federal regulation, and they really emphasize that you're looking at a multi-factor type of approach, and you're really looking hopefully at various sources of data and asking various questions and determining whether a child needs ESY. Now, aside from those fundamentals in the federal regulations and law, the feds do not tell the states how exactly you determine the need for ESY services. States have discretion to establish standards for ESY, and so do the federal courts, as they have done. And it's, if you look at the commentary from the that accompanied the regulations back in 2006, this is commentary from the Department of Education. They said, look, ESY is something there to protect the child's entitlement to FAPE. It's for kids that if they didn't get extended school year, they would lose their gains, they would lose FAPE. And that's the idea of extending the child school year for some students. And they said typically this happens over the summer, but it could happen at other times. It could happen after school, it could happen before school, it could happen during holiday breaks. But because kids have a fairly busy schedule during the school years, yes, typically ESY services, I think the main target time for ESY services is the summer, but it is possible to do it at other times. It is possible that you have a student that has such high regression potential that they'll regress very substantially even over a holiday break like Christmas. And that type of student might be entitled to ESY services over the holidays. Now, I think that's rare. I really haven't seen too many of those types of cases, but it could arise. First, if we look at the federal courts first said, schools can't just limit their services for special ed students to the school year because some students may need longer services to receive an appropriate education. I think the point is that some students will regress so substantially over the summer that they'll lose pretty much everything that they learned from the school year before. And those students really will need services beyond the regular school year to receive a FAPE, or more correctly, to maintain their FAPE so that they don't lose the FAPE that they obtained in the previous school year. Then next, the court started really issuing cases that talked about, how school districts should properly arrive at the determination of ESY services. In my circuit, the Fifth Circuit was one of the first to start talking about this. And I cite the Fifth Circuit case because your circuit, the Tenth Circuit, did cite it with approval. And the idea of the Alamo Heights case is if the child is going to have really substantial regression over the summer without a summer program, then that student may be entitled to year-round services. And I think what they meant was some level of services during the summer. And the whole idea of Alamo Heights is the question is whether the benefits that the student has gained during the school year will be significantly jeopardized if they don't get some programming during the summer. Now, the idea is not to maximize the student's progress, just to ensure that the student doesn't lose the progress that they've made, and you don't spend an unreasonable amount of time at the beginning of the school year just getting back to where you were. And then there's some newer cases. The Reinholzen case out of the Eighth Circuit in 2006 said, look, we're looking to prevent regression with ESY. It's not about advancing educational skills during ESY. The focus of ESY is on maintenance of skills gained and maintenance of the progress made in the prior school year. And thus, at the bottom of the slide, you see some cases where ESY was denied because the parent wanted to work on new goals. That's not what ESY is about. It's about ensuring that the progress made on the goals from the year prior, you don't lose that. And ESY was denied because the parents just wanted it as a form of transitioning the child to middle school. Again, no, it's got to be about ensuring that we don't lose the gains that the child has made in the previous year. And we arrive at your case, the Johnson case. This is your, daddy case for ESY services, although an older case, still authoritative and still controlling. And it dealt with a student with autism, but also a student that had a moderate intellectual disability and some seizure disorders. And the court noted that the whether a student experiences substantial regression, that's an important consideration. How long they take to recoup the regression, that these are key considerations. This is kind of like the focal point of determining whether the child needs ESY. And here's a quote. It's when you look at the amount of regression that the child suffers during the school months, and how long is it going to take them to recoup, and that's an important consideration. But it's not the only consideration. They said there's other factors that IEP teams should look at in determining what a student what a student may need in terms of ESY. For one, they said, analysis may look at perhaps you haven't had a regression up to now, but there's been a deterioration in the child's condition, and we should expect that they're going to regress at the end of this coming summer. So it's also about prediction of future regression in situations where a student's condition may be deteriorating as that can happen. So the court said regression and recoupment are probably the key considerations, but they're not the only considerations. Well, what are the other factors that are at play? Well, the severity of the child's impairment. I think the more severe the child's impairment, very likely the longer it's going to take them to make progress, and the quicker they're going to lose the progress that they made. How much regression is seen of the child, for example, over holidays, spring break, Christmas, and summer. How long does it take the child to recoup when they have regressed to get back to the point to where they were? Does the parent have any ability to provide any structure or any activities in the home that could help maintain the child's skills? The child's rate of progress, the slower the rate of progress, likely, it doesn't take much regression to cut into the progress that the child has made. I think the court also said you have to look at behavior and physical problems, that ESY isn't solely about academics. I think that is true. I think some kids where they're going to experience a substantial regression is in social skills, behavioral skills, or physical capacities. And they may need, for example, you may have a child with severe physical condition that may need adaptive PE as ESY over the summer. Are there alternate resources for the parents to get help for the child? Do they have opportunities for the child to interact with non-disabled peers? Are there areas that need continuous attention? I think that's an important one. Are there critical skill areas that if the child loses those skills, they're going to deteriorate into needing a more restrictive setting or needing a higher degree of services? And the child's vocational needs are also important. And lastly, the court said the ESY services shouldn't be extraordinary to the disability. And I think this language caused some confusion, but I want to translate legally what the court means. What the court means with that is that the ESY services must be relevant to the student's disability and to the critical skills that the student needs. And the quote from the court is, whether the requested ESY service is extraordinary to the child's condition as opposed to an integral part of the program for those with a child's condition. All the court is saying is the ESY must make sense. The focus of the ESY services has to be the skills that are impacted by the student's unique disability, that the services should focus on the critical skill areas that are most deeply impacted by the student's disability. In other words, that the ESY services must be relevant to the student's disability, not relevant to, let's say, parent needs or administrative preference or resources issues. Those would not be appropriate consideration. Importantly, the court said the child doesn't have to suffer regression after a summer in order to entitle themselves to ESY. You should be able to predict if the child's going to have a really significant regression. Schools can and should take data on students with high regression potential. How are they after a spring break? How are they after Christmas break? Does it take an unusual amount of time to get back to where we were just when we left? That's quite important for the ESY consideration. And you really want to make sure that you provide ESY so that you prevent significant regression or regression that deprives the child of learning to the point that it affects their progress towards self-sufficiency or their transition goals. Again, I think that has to do with focusing on the critical skill areas that if the child loses, they're going to kind of decline into needing additional services, a more restrictive environment, or not being able to meet certain transition goals. I'll move forward. Again, I think the main analysis that we are looking at is regression, recoupment, plus other factors. If you ask me, tell me as short as possible how you determine ESY for a student, whether they need it, and then what they need. And I'd say, well, it's about how much they regress and how quickly, how well they can recoup, plus other factors that are also relevant, those Johnson factors that we talked about. But if you notice, the Department of Education said, regression and recoupment are kind of the meat of the consideration. It's just that there's other factors there. I'll cite a couple of cases for you quickly, just to give you some flavor of what the courts have said about ESY on other points. The fact that a student is going to have regression is not sufficient for ESY. Why? Because every student regresses over the summer. Okay, there's a period at the beginning of the school year in every regular class where you have to kind of review and get kids back up to speed. We regress. I mean, after Christmas holidays, and did you not all experience a little bit of decompensation and getting back to exactly where you were and getting right back at the same speed that you were? Of course. So the mere fact of regression is not sufficient for ESY. It's that dangerous regression, that substantial regression that can't be recouped within a reasonable time. That's what can hurt a child. That's what we want to remedy with ESY. I'll give you a couple of cases. This case out of Hawaii, you had a teen with really severe dyslexia and didn't get ESY, but evidence showed that the reading would regress even over short breaks. And the court said this student's rapid regression supports the need for ESY. It makes sense. And the student had been routinely provided ESY in the prior year. So all of a sudden, the Hawaii IEP team decided, we're not going to do ESY this year. And that was successfully challenged. So, schools, from a practical standpoint, you probably, I think, teachers will want to document whether students have experienced any abnormal regression after Christmas and spring breaks, because that can be relevant to the ESY determination. And also the converse. If student after an extended Christmas break is able to get back on track within a few days, well, then maybe they regress normally but are able to recoup within a reasonable time. Maybe that type of student might not need ESY. Again, an individualized determination, but you also apply the other Johnson factors. I've been asked this question often. If we do ESY one year, does that mean we have to do ESY every year thereafter? No, it's an individualized year-by-year determination, as all IEP determinations are. That a child is experiencing substantial regression now doesn't mean they are not going to experience it the next year. Or it may mean they do. It may mean they will not. And the converse is also true. The fact that a child hasn't exhibited regression, but they may exhibit regression as their condition deteriorates, because some conditions are deteriorating. That may mean that the child will need ESY, even though they might not have needed it in the past. Okay. Houston case, a case out of Texas. The point of this case out of Texas is that this idea of how strongly a student regresses and how well they can recoup, that the people that are in the best vantage point to make that determination tend to be the classroom teachers, as opposed to private experts that see the child in one evaluation or doctors that see the child in isolated office visits. That the teacher data tends to be the most important data. And the data doesn't have to meet the highest statistical standards. In this court case out of Oregon, the expert said, well, we've analyzed this with this data point and this algorithm, and it's super fancy and it was done by a supercomputer. And the court said that's not actually necessary. The school's regression analysis doesn't have to meet the highest statistical standards for it to be appropriate. Again, look at another case. This is a Fourth Circuit case that again hammers the point that just that a parent says, but my child regresses doesn't necessarily mean that they need ESY, because look at what the court said. It's the statement that I made earlier. All students, disabled or not, regress to some extent during lengthy breaks from school. Regression that can be recouped within a reasonable short time frame is tolerated, as it doesn't jeopardize the overall receipt of FAPE. The letter to CLECA from the Department of Education in '98 clarified that just because a student doesn't meet all their IEP goals doesn't mean they need ESY services. The need for ESY must be addressed individually. But I want to add something here. If you have a child that has not mastered their goals and objectives from the previous year, I think that the IEP team has a couple of jobs to do. One is figure out why has the child not made appropriate progress on their goals, and secondly, is there anything that the IEP team can do to fix that? Because that may be an indicator either goals are set too ambitiously, that can be the case, or the services are insufficient to fuel progress on the goals. Okay, so just a note on that. A more recent letter from the Department of Education. Lack of progress, again, that's not the criteria for ESY services. It's more regression and recoupment, but the same note as in the prior slide. If you have lack of progress on IEP goals, what must the IEP team do? I'll tell you what it must do. Something. It's got to do something. If we haven't had appropriate progress and mastery of the goals, this must be addressed in some manner by the IEP team. Again, figuring out why are we not having appropriate progress and what can we do through the IEP process to ensure that that doesn't happen again. Quickly on the Cornwall case, this case caused some controversy, upset stomach, and queasiness in the tummy for a lot of school districts, because the point of the Cornwall case is that LRE applies during ESY. And if you have a child who's mostly mainstreamed and they need ESY services, that they should have some level of mainstreaming during the summer. But the court said districts don't have to create regular summer programs for this purpose. Actually, the court said you could contract with other public schools or private schools, which isn't necessarily either cost effective or practical. So that's the reason that this court case caused a lot of upset stomachs. Is if the court actually recognizes that it's making a decision that may not be able to be applied, because the court says if practical issues make it impossible or impracticable to provide an ESY program in the least restrictive environment, then the parent may lose the case there. And I think the court there is acknowledging that there are many situations where summer mainstreaming alternatives are impractical. If you're in a rural area, you've got no private schools near you, you've got no public schools near you to contract with. Of course, I think the practical implications is if you have an ESY student, you've got to think, are they mainstream during the school year? Because we may need to consider some mainstreaming for them during ESY. And schools that have a regular summer school, well, now you can integrate your special ed ESY kids into the summer program, right? I think of the summer program as sort of like summer regular ed. And you could facilitate some LRE by placing the students at least some of the time during ESY in that summer program for exposure to the regular curriculum. Again, on an individualized basis. But back to the criteria for ESY, again, most states and school districts lean on a regression recoupment analysis plus consideration of the additional relevant factors that the Johnson case talked about. And and I think that the idea of the regression and recoupment standard is you want to focus on preventing substantial regression that can't be recouped within a few weeks at the start of the school year. And I also think that you need to worry most about substantial regression in critical skill areas. By the way, I didn't put it in the materials because it's a Fifth Circuit case and it's kind of esoteric. But a friend of mine just litigated a case in which I was an expert witness on the fee issue. And the critical skill for the student was staying put in class and not eloping and leaving the classroom. Is that a critical skill? Oh, yeah. If you're a child with autism and you elope the classroom and you elope into a street, you could wind up seriously injured or you could be killed. So the court pointed out that regression and elopement should have called for a longer ESY period for a student because the court noticed that the student had regressed in not eloping from school and that the school's ESY was simply not long enough. Okay. And by the way, this idea that ESY can focus on the critical skill areas is a sound one. Look at letter to Myers from 1989, another letter from the Department of Education that says it's okay for ESY to focus only on some skill areas. Which skill areas? The one where you see the student regresses the most, particularly in critical skill areas. Those are the ones that you do not want to see regression on. So, main criteria could be a documented potential for substantial regression in critical skill areas that you think cannot be recouped within the first weeks of the school year. That's a good kind of working idea for determining ESY. And the data points are what regression you see after school breaks. What if you didn't provide ESY last year? How was the start of the school year? After not providing ESY, or is there a prognosis where your evaluations or other experts are saying that the child has a condition that's going to worsen, that's going to deteriorate, so they might not have regressed last year, but are going to regress in the future? And the criteria that you use would need to track the requirements of the Johnson case. Again, meaning you're going to have to look at those additional factors that Johnson discusses. I went over them in a previous slide, but for purposes of kind of keeping them present in our mind, here they are. Okay. And all of these make absolute sense to think about in making the ESY determination. So I see the ESY determination as being primarily regression and recoupment, but also consideration of these additional factors in making the decision whether the child needs ESY. I think that the IEP team should identify the specific goals that you're going to target in ESY. Usually, they're not new goals, they're goals from the previous school year, but which goals are you going to really work on in ESY? Now we're getting to what we're going to do during ESY. And I think it makes sense to work on the goals that work on the critical skill areas where regression potential is highest, or if the child regresses, it's going to be most damaging to their education. I mean, what's a critical skill? I mean, a critical skill to me is one that if you lose it, it's going to be bad news for you as a student. It's going to mean you're going to need a more restrictive environment. You're going to lose self-sufficiency, maybe access to community-based instruction or vocational opportunities, for example. That would be pretty dire. Um, when is the regression substantial so that you can't recoup it within a reasonable time? I think an indicator is data that shows that after a school break, you're winding up teaching the material from the previous weeks for a significant period. I mean, kids should get back to speed fairly quickly. And if you asked me which of the Johnson factors, because those are a lot, right? That's a lot of factors to look at and to, these hurt the brain when you look at them all at once. So if you asked me which of the factors are most important, well, I'd say the child's rate of progress is really important. I think the areas that need continuous attention, which are the areas where if you don't provide instruction every day, the child seems to decline. Those are likely going to be critical skill areas or high regression potential areas. I think also it's important what the parent tells you their plans are for the summer. Do they have activities lined up? Have they hooked up the child with some other agencies that provide education or education adjacent type of opportunities? And the relevance of the ESY services requested. If the parent asks for something that doesn't make sense given the child's disability, the critical skill areas, and the areas where the child regresses, then that's not relevant and you don't have to provide it. That's that extraordinary type of service. And then you don't have to provide that. Some warnings for schools. Okay. Resist the tendency to standardize ESY. I still deal with this with all my school districts. My school districts want to say ESY is these 3 weeks in the middle of the summer, and that's it. And that's we're going to open one campus, and it's going to be and that's it. That's going to be our ESY. I always tell them you could have a core ESY period, but you have to understand that some kids might need less, but some kids are going to need more. And for them, you're going to have to add to your standardized ESYs. And in fact, I tell them stay away from that notion at all. You can say we have a core time frame for ESY, and we can add to it or subtract from it as necessary. What populations tend to be the higher regression populations? Kids with more severe autism, intellectual disability, severe physical conditions. These are kids that are likely to experience severe regression if they don't have structured programming over the summer. But I want to caution you from the very start, and this is part of those federal baseline fundamental rules, you can't limit ESY to certain eligibility categories. You can't say we only do ESY for kids with AU and ID, and that's it. You can't say that. Other students may need ESY services. So I was asked kind of what are good guiding questions for the ESY determination. Well, I'd say, does the student exhibit significant regression after school breaks is probably the most important issue. Yeah, it's and the next is the regression in a key skill, a critical skill that we've been working on a long time, and it's really, really important. Like it might be for a child, it's more severe. It might be we got him to the point where he's got good life skills, dressing, feeding, um, washing and so forth, and decline in those is really going to be impactful to the child. That's a kind of an example of a critical skill area. For another child, critical skill area may be reading. That if they don't get some instruction in reading, as in the Hawaii case, the student's going to decline so much that they're going to be that reading progress that they made in the previous year is going to be jeopardized. I think the third guiding question I think is important is when there is regression, does the child recoup it in a short time or not? Does it take kind of a longer time to recoup? And there's no standardized times for this. It's like, well, it's got to be recouped in X amount of time. And that's sort of, again, an individualized determination because kids are going to progress at their own rate and also regress at their own rate and recoup at their own rate. The key consideration here is if the recoupment just seems to be lagging and taking an unusual amount of time to get back to where we were, it's an indicator that you have a high regression potential student, and that's a target for needing ESY. Is the regression such that it would compromise the progress made during the school year? And we don't want that. We don't want to jeopardize the FAPE that we got in the previous year. Are there skill areas that we appear to need to work on continuously for this student in order for the student to make any progress on those? I mean, those may be areas where we have to do ESY for those. Are parents able to provide helpful activities during school breaks? That's one of the important Johnson factors. Does the student make limited progress as is? I mean, if you've got a student who makes not a lot of progress, which may be fate for them, right? If they have a pretty significant disability, but it doesn't take much to lose a small amount of progress. Again, that hurts for that student. Students that make limited amount of progress during the school year and are the ones that are likely most easily going to lose that. And those you got to look at those kids a little bit more carefully. And then back to the Johnson factors, are there non-academic problems that might substantially regress and take a long time to recoup? Physical, social, behavioral problems. You know, there's some kids maybe more in the mental health issue realm, severe emotional disturbance that can actually do okay on the academics, but the problems for them can be more in the behavioral area and the social skills area. And sometimes for those kids, if they don't get services during the summer, they're going to decline so much at the beginning of the school year is really rough behaviorally, and it takes time to kind of stabilize the student. I think too often we think of ESY as maintenance of life skills or academic competencies, but ESY is not limited in that fashion. Critical skill areas can run the board, depending on the student. Will the student have opportunities for interaction with non-disabled children during school breaks, particularly for kids with social skills issues? It can be really important that during the summer they have some opportunities to engage and socialize with other kids, hopefully their age, but other kids can do as well. Are there vocational and transition goals that we're not going to be able to make the appropriate progress on if the student doesn't get some services on those during the summer? You know, again, you got to think academics, the physical, emotional, behavioral, but also vocational, pre-vocational, or transition in terms of ESY services. What are the key and critical skill areas that we think the child is going to regress in most substantially? And then now getting to kind of what are we going to provide? What services will address these critical skill areas? Will the student need related services during ESY? You know, ESY has to consist, there's a slide on this, on special education services, okay? But sometimes for a child to benefit from special ed, they need the related service. So some kids will need related services during ESY so they can benefit from their special ed services during ESY. And then more nitty-gritty questions. Kind of a judgment call. How many weeks of summer ESY services will be needed to maintain the skills, to prevent the regression? How many days per week of services? How many hours per day? These are all decisions that the IEP team has to make based on their regression and recoupment data and the application of the Johnson factors. Not easy, but it's a judgment call that school districts across the country have to make. You just have to get experience at figuring out which kids are the high regression potential kids and how you have to structure your ESY services to be flexible to cover all your kids. I've been asked, can we postpone ESY determination? For example, if the annual IEP meeting is held in September, can we wait until closer to the end of the school year to decide on ESY? Yes, I think so. I think the court cases and OSAB decisions have said that that's fine. But be better remember, right? If the IEP team says, hey, we're going to meet closer to the end of the school year to determine need for ESY based on regression, recoupment data, and the Johnson factors, you better get back to it. Don't forget to have that IEP meeting. Just make sure you reconvene in a timely fashion to address the need for ESY. Again, ESY services can't just be related services. Why? Because related services are just there for the child to benefit from the special ed they're simultaneously receiving. ESY services have to consist of specially designed instruction, of special education services, and perhaps participation in a summer program, but only for LRE purposes. But you can't just provide a related service. You can't just provide OT, for example, during the summer. This question comes up if the child has not made progress because of significant truancy must the IEP team consider ESY? And a court case out of Washington said no. I mean, truancy is different, but I must caution IEP teams, truancy is a behavior that you have to address. You can't, you know what, if a student has attendance problems, whether they're due to disability or they're volitional, like they're skipping school, they have to be addressed by the IEP team with functional behavioral assessments, behavior interventions, counseling, or other IEP services. You just can't watch a student not attend school as an IEP team and not take some steps to try to address it. And you might not succeed, but you have to take the steps that are available to you. ESY is not always a summer program. We talked about that at the beginning of the presentations. It is possible for a student to need ESY as an extended school day or during extended holidays. I think this will be rare, but some students have super high regression potential. I do think that most of the time you're going to find that you can meet your students' ESY needs during the longest extended break in the annual schedule, the summer break. Why? Well, the longer the break, the more possibility for substantial regression. And thus, that's where we tend to park the ESY services, but it makes sense. It makes sense. Summer school. Summer school is not ESY. Again, ESY is a special education program. It's built to work on certain goals from the child's previous IEP that represent critical skill areas or areas that may experience substantial regression. Summer school is a non-individualized regular ed program, usually for kids that just failed the year before. But participation of a special ed kid in your summer school program could be part of an ESY program, particularly if you've got a student who's trying to work on social skills, maybe behavior, maintaining regular ed curriculum standards. Also helps you comply with LRE. Make sure we don't get in trouble with a Crownwell case, right? Summer school without individualized special ed services, that's not ESY. That's not going to meet the standards for ESY. And then last few minutes, there's some questions that tend to come up. What if the parents don't want ESY services? You can't force parents to avail themselves of ESY services. But here's the mistake that I see IEP teams make. The parent says, we're not going to want ESY. So they say, groovy, then we don't have to plan it. And that to me is a mistake. If the IEP team thinks that the child needs ESY, you should plan it. You should plan the package of ESY services and put it on the IEP. And the mom's going to say, I told you I don't want those ESY services. You tell the parent, we have to put them on the IEP if we think the child needs them. If you don't take advantage of them, we can't force you to. We urge you to reconsider. I would also tell them that because we think if you don't take advantage of the ESY services, the start of the school year is going to be rough. What do you mean rough? I mean your child's going to take a long time to get back to just where they were. So one, I think part of it is make sure you document your offer of ESY in the IEP, document the parent's rejection, but you want to document also that you're telling the parents about the possible consequences of their decision. Because later, if the child doesn't make all the progress that you had hoped, because there's lots of recoupment time that you spend at the beginning of the school year, and the parent complains, you can say, look, we told you about that. You really need to think about ESY a little bit more. How should social skills and behavior skills in ESY, don't forget about those. I think those can be areas that are critical skill areas where the student experiences a lot of regression. The nitty gritty, how should staff collect data on regression after school breaks? I mean, you could sit down with the IEP goals and you kind of knew where you were at before the break. And then where are you now? And how long is it taking you to get back to the rate of progress that the student was at on each of the goals, on each of the objectives? Sit down once, and how long does it take again to get the child back? I think that's good regression data there. What if the IEP team decided ESY wasn't needed and oof, you were wrong, and suddenly the child exhibits severe regression at the beginning of the school year and you're not able to recoup it within a reasonable time? That's an indicator that the child really does need ESY. And that also may be an indicator that the IEP team has to consider, buttressing the special ed services, maybe with compensatory services, because the child kind of lost out on something that you should have provided, right? That's where we provide compensatory services to the child. We make sure the child gets ESY the next year. What if the student doesn't attend ESY? Document it. Let the parents know this is going to impact how the start of the year works out. Remember related services during ESY. You may have to provide those if they're needed for the child to benefit from their special ed. Disciplinary removals during ESY. Obviously, that's possible, and all the rules apply as in the school year. And make sure you organize your ESY terms in a flexible fashion. I mean, some of my districts kind of do two ESY terms with a teeny little break in the middle of the summer and then two terms of ESY. Just make sure that it's flexible. Just make sure that you're never saying, well, these are our 3 or 4 weeks of ESY and that's it. It better cover all the kids because that's how we determine. No, it's got to be individualized. You have to be flexible. You have to say, maybe this is our core ESY period, but it can be expanded as necessary. Okay, I think I stopped at about the time that I wanted to stop to get questions. Okay, I'll start with one of the chat questions. Ms. Hamill says, when considering the list of possible factors to consider generated by the courts, mostly your court, the Johnson court, should the seemingly unrelated items be considered through the lens of recoupment or maintenance challenges for the student? Well, the way that I see it is regression and recoupment are sort of your key considerations, but you must also address the other factors. And I disagree that they're unrelated. I think they are related. What are they related to? They all have to do with how much the child's going to regress over the summer, mostly, how long it's going to take them to recoup. If you look at all those factors, they're all kind of around that. They're relevant factors to the ESY determination. Thus, I don't see them as just these scattered factors just coming from anywhere. No, they make sense. The Johnson factors make sense. Other questions? If related services are not allowed through ESY, would primary age SLP students not be eligible? First of all, I want to clarify, related services are not only allowed during ESY, they may be required. The point I was making is generally your ESY program can't be pure related service because it doesn't make sense. The related service is there to enable the child to benefit from simultaneous special ed service. So to the contrary, at times related service is necessary. If you have a child with fairly significant disabilities and without OT, they wouldn't benefit from their special ed services provided during ESY. You're going to have to provide an appropriate amount of OT services during ESY. Now, as you know, speech language is a little bit different. Under the federal rules, a state can make speech language pathology a special ed service or a related service. And I think that might be an exception. If you think that the speech language is the area where the child is going to regress most substantially, and obviously it's a critical skill area, and the provision of speech language pathology services would serve to maintain those language skills. I think that you could get away with providing just the speech language services, maybe also have the child integrated into the summer school program for an appropriate period of time for LRE purposes and practicing those language skills may be appropriate.
Yeah, Jose, I apologize. I was typing really fast and that kind of came out wrong.
That's fine. I get it though.
My question was really if we have a student in a primary that is only receiving speech services during the year, would they be eligible if that was their uh, only service identified, be eligible for ESY?
I think so. I think so. I think if, again, if the IEP team determined that the speech and language skills are the skills that would regress and the regression would be substantial and couldn't be recouped within a reasonable time if the student didn't get some speech services over the summer. Yeah, I think that that's one, a student who needs ESY, and the form of ESY is going to be those speech services. Yes. And remember, I mean, speech language pathology, it can be a special ed service. It's entirely for the state to determine. So it behaves like a special ed service. It's sort of a hybrid, right? Because it's a pull-out service, but in many states, it's considered a special ed service itself. Other questions? You guys don't have to write them, participants. You can raise your hand and ask questions.
Jose, there's a question regarding progress monitoring for ESY. Do they have to document progress monitoring for ESY?
Is IEP goal progress reporting required for ESY? I think you have to be monitoring progress on ESY, but you're monitoring in a slightly different way, right? In that you're ensuring that the child's not regressing substantially in that goal. During the school year, your progress monitoring is looking for the child to be making progress on the goal. Whereas during ESY, your progress monitoring is focused on ensuring that the child's not regressing in that goal competency. So, yes, uh, I'd say progress monitoring is required, but its focus is slightly different because during the summer, you're not looking to make more progress than you did at the end of the year with a goal. You're just making sure that by the end of the summer, the child hasn't regressed in that goal.
I'm going to jump in. This is Shelley. I can't seem to find a raise the hand thing, so I'm sorry.
That's fine. Jump in.
So I'm curious about on one of the slides, there was a statement about considering ESY for, it said vocational goals cannot be met without ESY.
Yes.
I'm interested in how does that align with the concept of an appropriately calculated annual goal if we need to be making progress during ESY, and how does that jive
I think
with
that what I am meaning, and again, I'm paraphrasing what the court cases have said, including the Johnson case. I think their concern is just you can't forget about vocational areas when you're thinking about ESY. It is not about making progress during ESY on vocational. It's making sure that the vocational skills you had at the end of the school year, the ones that your hard work enabled the child to have certain vocational competencies at the end of the school year, that you don't lose those over the summer. So it's not like it, but the way that it was phrased, it might have given an idea that that's what it meant, but it isn't. It's about ensuring that vocational skills are part of the skills that you're looking at as an ESY, and that a child doesn't lose critical vocational skills over the summer. It's not that they have to be making a progress during that ESY. Again, it's about maintaining certain vocational skills. And again, it's your data that's going to have to tell you and your individualized observations of the student, okay, here we are at where in his pre-vocational or vocational competencies. If we don't do work over the summer, is he going to lose that progress to the point that we're not going to be able to get back to where we were within a reasonable time? Because if the answer to that is no, we're not going to be able to get back there within a reasonable time, then the child needs ESY in those vocational areas, but not new goals or not a progress beyond what you had at the end of the year.
Thank you.
I think you guys will be able to access this PowerPoint.
Jose, I put the link for them in the chat, and then they
Right.
can always go. And then Mandy has her hand raised. Mandy, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, hi. It might be like a super obvious question, but when we're looking at disciplinary removals for like manifestation purposes, did that count towards the previous year's removals, right? Not, it wouldn't count towards like the upcoming year removals.
Who knows? My answer. The Department of Education has never issued clear guidance to answer that question.
Okay.
I don't know if they see it as part of the previous school year or they see it as part of the upcoming school year, or whether in fact they see it as something different. They just kind of count them over the summer. I guess for me, I would say to be safe. Okay, since we don't know the exact answer to the question, my safe answer is don't do more than 10 days of removal from ESY on a discipline basis, like suspension. And if you're going to kick the kid out of ESY longer than 10 days in a row for like a long-term removal, that you're going to need a manifestation determination. I think those two safe things I think are okay. But
Okay.
yeah, I don't really know if they are if you do two suspension days, are they appended to the suspension days that you had in the previous years, or they now glom on to the new school year? I can't answer that because there's not a case or guidance document that has told us that.
Okay.
Jose,
Thank you.
and kind of a related issue to that is um, some schools still have the ESY sessions align with their general education summer school offerings, and along with that comes some general school offerings policies, such as if you don't show up for 3 days or 5 days, then they're going to drop them the uh, from the summer school or ESY. And there's other issues around that, right? But I know that's been some practice that maybe they get dropped because they didn't show up for 3 days. Would that be considered disciplinary? Would it? How would that impact delivery of ESY? If what kind of, I guess, guidance would you give districts that maybe encounter that particular issue?
Don't do it. Pretty simple. I don't know if it's disciplinary or not, but it is a denial of ESY.
Okay, thank you.
I simply don't think that it is consistent with IDEA and with your ESY responsibilities to
Right.
basically apply a rule that says if you don't show up for 3 days, poof, we're just going to pretend you don't need ESY anymore. No, I just can't abide by that. You have a duty to offer the ESY services that the IEP team determined are necessary. If the child's not attending ESY, you should send letters to the parent, you should be contacting the parent, and you should be in those communications indicating to the parent that not taking advantage of the ESY services is going to have consequences in terms of the child regressing and not being able to recoup. But kind of penalizing the student by kind of removing the ESY that the IEP team already said was necessary due to an arbitrary rule that you might apply to regular ed kids, just don't do it. I mean, not to the special ed kids. The special ed kids are not regular ed kids. They've got certain rights to the services that the IEP team dictated. Now, applying that kind of a rule to your summer school regular ed students may be an appropriate exercise of policy, but with respect to the special ed students, you're going to risk legal claims.
Certainly, that would never happen in Wyoming. You know what? I just want to put an asterisk. Maybe other states are watching.
Right? If in other states and so forth. I think that I encounter that in my own school district. We have, for example, I've had principals tell me, well, if we have a kid and we have a policy that says if they don't appear for 10 days in a row, that we can just drop them from the rolls. And I tell them that policy is intended to apply for kids that have moved away and the parent hasn't come in to simply go through the process of disenrolling them. But if you know that that special ed student is in town, that they still live there, you can't just disobligate yourself from FAPE through a little attendance policy. I mean, you're gonna suffer the legal consequences. These are again some of the extra protections that special ed kids have based on federal law.
Could I add on to my question?
Sure.
So say our district, say we, since there's no guidance, say we do our manifestation and we count it with our previous year and our ESY day is 4 hours long. Would I calculate my hours based on that 4 hour day? Or would I do like how we would have a 7 hour day typically?
I'd say that that's the day for ESY. And again, there's not guidance on that, but I could
Okay.
easily see a hearing officer or a court saying, well, no, that the day for ESY is a 4 hour day. So if you've suspended the child for that day, it's a whole day, even though it's 4 hours. You can't say that it's a half day suspension.
Yeah.
You suspended the child for the whole ESY period. But look, on this discussion of discipline, I kind of would approach it differently. If
Okay.
if you have a child during ESY is creating behavioral problems in the classroom, I think you need to have an IEP meeting. Why? Is this child experiencing behavior problems? Are we not implementing the behavior intervention plan? Do we not have one? Should we? What's causing the student to all of a sudden have behaviors that maybe we haven't seen? Because if there are behaviors we have seen, we probably should have an FBA and BIP in place. I mean, so I think that our energies better than figuring out how the rules might work and what the hours
Mhm.
were. It's like, how do we figure out how to get this kid to behave? How do we figure out ways to improve the behavior so that they take advantage of the ESY? I think our energies and brain power should be devoted to that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Love you all background of beautiful Wyoming sites. Really nice. Driving through Wyoming is sort of driving through a Western movie, beautiful Western movie, and everything changes, and they have vistas and plains, and suddenly there's mountains, and you guys are real lucky with that.
Well, if there's no last minute questions, Jose, we definitely don't want to tie up your whole evening. But we thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. This has been amazing, as always. And I know that some were wondering if this will be available. Yes, the recording and the slides will be shared on that link that I just put in the chat for you. And I hope that all of you have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions, and thanks for the opportunity. Hope to see you sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jose. Everybody have a great day.